Welcome to King County Connects, where we connect you with some of the important issues in the county and in our region. I'm ENRIQUE, CERNA. An endemic of mass shootings and now a wave of mass marches against gun violence. King County has a new unit designed to help families keep firearms away from people in crisis. The Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit is housed in the King County Courthouse. We're talking today with Program Manager SANDRA Shanahan and Prosecuting Attorney KIMBERLY WYATT to talk more about the program, how it's working, how it all came about. Well, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. Well, you know, as we have this conversation, we are also coming off a time, as we noted here, with people around the country are really on heightened alert about the issue of gun violence, particularly what's happening in the schools, the marches that have happened across the country. I'm kind of curious, with the work you do, to see that happening, what does it mean to the work you do?
Well, I think it's incredibly powerful. I think it's a powerful time in the country, and especially just to see the youth, you know, come together and to make strides where some of the adults haven't been able to do, right? The movement in gun violence. So I think it's incredibly timely and powerful, and our unit hopefully is going to enhance that effort.
Does it help the work that you're doing?
It does help the work, and it clearly shows that people across the nation are looking for tools, looking at tools for intervention, options to get people help who may need it, opportunities to remove firearms when it's necessary because of the level of dangerousness. So it's been very reinforcing of this important work that we have been able to get started in the beginning of this year.
Right. Well, let's talk about a little bit of background here about how you got here. For one thing, the legislature had taken some action regarding this issue of extreme situations, and that was in 2016. But they passed it, and it was really an unfunded mandate, so it was sort of left up to counties, but it was there. Give me a little bit of the history and how that happened, and then how the county ended up picking up the ball here.
Sure. So what you're talking about is Washington's Extreme Risk Protection Order, which
Right.
did pass by the Citizens Initiative and became law in December of 2016. And we refer to it as ERPO. So if you hear that term, that's what that means,
Right.
ERPO. So in Washington's Extreme Risk Protection Order was backed in part by California's Gun Violence Restraining Order, and that was done after family members came to law enforcement repeatedly and said, we have concerns about our son, you need to do something, and it turns out that that individual went out and committed a mass shooting, I believe in the Isla Vista, Santa Barbara area.
Right.
And I believe that's how California's Gun Violence Restraining Order came about, and then Washington also, I think, modeled it a little bit behind their same policies.
But it took a while for this to actually then, after it was, you know, approved by voters and also given a lot of support for that matter, for then it to be implemented in some way, to actually see something happening, and yet King County then stepped up.
Yeah, so back in about mid-2016, a group was convened by Judge Ann Levinson to really look at how firearm laws were being enforced in our county on the heels of ESHB 1840, which basically had our state law mirror the federal law, saying if you have a qualifying protection order, you cannot possess a firearm. We had work groups for about 18 to 22 months, and the ERPO legislation came about during the period of time that we were working in our work groups. And so we added that into our work plan. We learned so much about some of the implementation barriers of 1840 that it made logical sense to start looking at ERPOs and how can we apply what we learned about some of the challenges with 1840 to ERPO. With any new law, there has to be awareness of it and implementation, and one of the things that our office our new unit has been really focusing on is how do we raise awareness and let the public, let law enforcement know about this really important tool.
And the county did step up in that they funded this to make it actually happen, which, as I mentioned before, was an unfunded mandate. And so, but having the county step up to actually do that was an important step to make this happen.
That was huge. And in our work group and looking at implementation, we always came back to the point that there is nobody who is dedicated to doing this work. And in that absence, you fall upon people who may say, well, I can take on these little pieces, but I can't do the whole thing. And having funding from the City of Seattle and from King County to say this is important and we need to have dedicated people that create a multi-disciplinary team that's multi-jurisdictional is essential to the success that we've had so far in the first couple of months of our program.
So let's talk about how this works and how you two work together to make this happen and to provide some sense of security and help for someone that might be in a tough situation. Walk me through that.
Specific to extreme risk protection
Right.
orders? Okay. So just to give you some general background on what it is so that the public is aware, the extreme risk protection order is an order that prohibits a restrained party's access to firearms and CPL. So it's not about restricting a person, say like another protection order would do. There's no actual restrictions towards another person, if that makes sense. This is strictly about firearms. And an ERPO is appropriate when somebody's having a mental health crisis or exhibiting dangerous behavior. And those are the two main categories of what we're seeing and what it was designed for.
And families are in this as far
Correct.
as they're the ones that can step up and say,
So
we need help.
That's correct. So it's either family members or a household member. So you could be a roommate in the past year if you've lived together with that person, or law enforcement. And most of the ones that we've been seeing in King County have been done or initiated by law enforcement with our assistance in our unit.
And then when someone goes through this process and says, okay, I think we've got a real issue here, where do they go? Do they come to the prosecutor's office, or how do they do that?
So we've designed our unit to have, we have law enforcement on our unit, we have prosecutors, and most of the outreach has come to date from law enforcement reaching directly out to our prosecutors saying, hey, we have somebody in our jurisdiction who's exhibiting behaviors that make me think that they're a danger to themselves or others, and they connect with our prosecutors. We also have a firearms advocate who is available for family members who wish to initiate an extreme risk protection order against someone, a loved one. We have not done any to date, which is interesting, but when I look at the statistics of the ERPOs to date, most of them are initiated by law enforcement. Only a handful have been done by family or household members. So that tells us that our unit needs to do more outreach and information about this as a tool for family members and loved ones to pursue.
Let them know, to get the word out there,
so that
as
they
we're
can
doing
know.
here right now.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's important for people to know that this is a civil process that they can initiate without an attorney. They can hire an attorney if they want to, and it's typically a two-part process where they come in, fill out paperwork. Our advocate can help them do so. They'd have to write a statement including all of the concerns and behaviors that the person has been exhibiting, or threats that they've made of self-harm or harm to the community. And then they see a judge that same day. And the judge is vetting it to determine that there are facts sufficient to enter that order for a temporary 2-week period of time. The other party gets served, the firearms are removed, and then they both come back to court, and the judge will listen to testimony from both parties to get a sense of whether this order should continue for the next year.
So we have the legal part of it through the prosecutor's office. We have your advocacy group. How many people are we talking about altogether here that are part of this? In
Our unit?
Yeah, right.
We have, I think we have 7 law enforcement officers, and we have, I think, about 6 or 8 non-commissioned staff. So 3 prosecutors, a firearm advocate, a firearm surrender coordinator, a court order problem solver, a paralegal, and myself as the program manager.
And the City of Seattle is also connected to this, right?
There.
We have a partnership with Seattle Police Department, King County Sheriff's Office, Seattle City Attorney's Office, and the King County Prosecutor's Office. We've entered into a memorandum of understanding that we will provide services to this unit. And what's so critical about those partnerships is that each of us have a distinct role that we play so that we can provide assistance kind of from beginning to end. So we have our upfront assistance that our advocates and our coordinators can provide in doing outreach to victims, in kind of investigating whether people have access to firearms. We have our prosecutors who can determine if any laws have been violated, if the orders have been complied with. We have law enforcement who can serve the orders, who can remove the firearms. So it was really designed with this idea that there are lots of different points of access, and with that comes specific expertise. And so I feel like, our first 3 months of our new unit have been quite successful to date. It's been very exciting.
So in these first 3 months, what has happened? How many guns have you been able to, I guess, get away from people that might be dangerous and concerned about?
So during our pilot, which was approximately March through the end of 2017, I believe there were about 150 firearms removed. Mm-hmm. And then from the beginning of this year to date, I think we're up at about 60 or so. And the approach that our officers are using is a warm approach. So nobody's going in at this point knocking down doors, but really reaching out to people saying, hey, you're subject to an order that says you need to turn over your firearms. I can help you with that right now. I can take them in, we can fill out the paperwork, and I'll file it for you. And people have been pretty supportive of that and have been complying.
The work that both of you have done really has been in the domestic violence field. How important is this in helping women or others that might find themselves? It can be children, it can be sons and daughters. How critical is this to have this type of unit and to be available to make a difference here?
I think it's critical because we know from research that if there's a firearm in the home, whether it be a domestic violence situation or somebody in a mental health crisis, that raises that individual, whoever's living in that home, at, I think it's 5 times greater risk of dying from violence by a firearm, right? So we do feel like this is critical public safety, public health information for people to learn about this tool. It's one other option in the toolbox, as we would say.
Right, and it prevents, the goal is harm reduction and preventing community violence, violence to family and household members, law enforcement, which people seem to forget that, or sometimes forget that law enforcement are at grave risk in responding to homes where there's domestic violence and firearms. And also, this other point that's so important is to prevent suicide. We know that people who are, sometimes people who are exhibiting abusive behavior are at greater risk of committing acts of suicide. And when I've looked at the ERPO's file to date, 2/3 of them are suicidal people. And those are not all in domestic violence relationships, but this is an important tool for a loved one who knows that their family member is going through a hard time, that they can get access to a court system that's designed to be accessible and try to intervene at a really critical point of danger.
I mean, we talk about this is related to domestic violence type of situations, but it goes beyond that, really.
Absolutely.
Tell me about that. Tell me what other types of things that we're...
Well, I think what we've seen to date is we've seen, especially on the ERPOs, we've seen largely threats of suicide, but we've also seen threats of suicide combined with threats of community violence to churches, to law enforcement, to elected officials. We've seen concerns about school-related violence. So it really, these days, we are far more aware of the significance of those types of threats, and the Extreme Risk Protection Order has given us a tool to intervene when one didn't exist. And so I feel really grateful that we have this as an option in our community, and it is, due process is built into it so that people can feel or rest assured that constitutional rights are being protected, and that, there's an opportunity to get help for people who need it.
It just seems like it is so important now because we are in this, I don't even know how to describe it, the situation where the fact that these acts of gun violence, in particular happening in schools and obviously bringing people out to be so concerned about all of this, it's at a heightened awareness thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which ought to help your work, I would imagine.
It does. I think it brings, it definitely brings awareness. We're getting daily, if not, I would say in the beginning it was weekly calls from law enforcement, and we've had a couple citizens have reached out too. through different avenues concerned about someone having access to firearms. But now, in the last couple of weeks, we've been getting daily calls from law enforcement in different jurisdictions,
Really?
even to say, hey, what do you think about the situation? Do you think this ERPO is appropriate here? And so we kind of walk through the facts with them and try to guide that process, because sometimes if you're going to file a criminal charge, we might have more teeth in a criminal no contact order with an order to surrender weapons generated out of that case. So we're evaluating and talking them through that process to see when an ERPO is appropriate.
So is King County at the forefront on all of this?
I would say for sure, just
In Washington State?
I would, just because we're dedicated, we have a team of people and this is what we do every day. So by default, we became, I would say, so-called experts in the field just by doing it day after day. And by kind of triaging those legal issues that nobody's done before and staffing them as a team and figuring out how do we advise law enforcement, how do we advise the community, knowing that we have so many eyes on us at the same time, but trying to be very thoughtful about that process as well.
What types of questions, I guess, are they calling about and wondering, okay, what do I need to be concerned about? How do we make this work?
Sometimes, we've had where somebody's been arrested on a DUI, and so during that investigation, the person was making suicidal statements, even made a statement about referencing a school shooting, making a comment about being into school shooting, that type of thing. Very alarming statements to law enforcement, which they would always be alarmed by those statements, but especially now calling and saying, is this an appropriate case to also do an extreme risk protection order on? And we did do one in that case just last week.
Are other counties trying to implement some? I would imagine it's money to be able to do this.
I think so. We've consulted briefly with Snohomish County and with Pierce County a little bit on cases when they're calling us and asking general questions, and I think they're interested in developing something similar, perhaps. Mm-hmm. They've reached out about that, but I don't know anyone else that's formalized something quite like we've done here in Seattle and King County.
What about elsewhere in the country? Are other states actively trying to do something like this? I would imagine it has to do whether they have a law that's related to that too.
I think California has the gun violence restraining order. There are, 5 or 6 other states that have this law that they can pursue, and the other states that are looking into it. We've had outreach from people across the country wanting to connect with our unit and learn how we did it, and to share what they're doing. And so I think that's been a very interesting aspect of our new unit is once somebody goes live, you have a lot of people who say, we are on the precipice of starting something and we want to learn from your experience. And I think we've gained a lot of really important insight and support from other jurisdictions that want to do something and just, kind of wading out into an area of unknown. It's important to note that our data systems don't speak to each other. These are laws that haven't, necessarily been enforced fully over the years, and so there's not a lot of infrastructure. And I think the mission of our work has included creating and laying down that infrastructure and trying to build relationships. Because when we first started having these conversations, I think the feedback was just pushback of like, you'll never get anywhere. And that was, informed by a lot of different experiences over the years, but having a dedicated unit has really helped us to push through.
So I take it you've had to push back on the pushback.
Oh, I think that's a daily thing. And I would say you do. I think it's an education like anything else. People don't really have the capacity to take on new work, so it's educating law enforcement and others about really what we're doing and how we're here to assist you. And it may be a little bit more work, but also just educating that what the purpose is behind doing that, right? And when you come at it to a law enforcement and say, really, these are really dangerous individuals that have had threats of suicide by cop or, have specific intentions to harm law enforcement, we reach out also to say, we're concerned for your safety. If you're going to serve this protective order, you need to be aware about this, this dangerous individual as well. So we're trying to share information and also educate, but there is definitely challenges along the way. Do
you feel like you're pioneering something here?
Absolutely.
Yes, for sure. I would say that. Yeah.
In setting the standards and the template for everything as far as
that's our hope. Our hope is that with a lot of intentional decision making and relationship building, that we'll be able to build an infrastructure that can be replicated in other areas. And we are more than grateful to the City of Seattle and King County for funding us to do this really important work, because without it, none of this breaking ground would be happening.
Right. This has to be tremendously fulfilling. Obviously, it's also been a lot of work in trying to set some standards and do all of that. I'm curious, as the work that you've done, both of you have worked in issues of domestic violence. The gun aspect in all of this, how prevalent is that? And how dangerous and people, are they aware?
Well, I think when we did studies in the beginning, we were told that the average gun ownership in King County is 8.1 per person who owns firearms. And that was one of the biggest things when we started reading these petitions and working with victims, is really learning how many firearms are really out there. And that was pretty shocking, I think. But it's not a huge surprise, I don't think, to us that have been in this field doing DV work, that guns are often used as a form of intimidation and control to victims, and also in the homes with many children, right?
Yes.
Right. I would imagine that the aspect of the impact on a child is got to be extremely devastating for them long term. How do you deal with that, or do you?
Well, we have an advocate that is doing outreach to families and to do safety planning around all of those issues. I know in my history of working on domestic violence cases involving firearms, for years we were aware of firearms, and it was very frustrating to not really be able to do anything about them, because we did not have a state law that prohibited somebody from possessing. And then when we did have it, it was really difficult to get enforcement of that law. And so I feel like survivors who are coming forward now are able to speak a little more freely about the firearms that may be in play, knowing that there are people who can follow up on it. And we can't, there's no guarantee of safety. People always are going to have to safety plan around firearms with themselves and their children, just because there's no guarantee. But we are so much better at intervening now that we have tools and resources in place. And the other important thing, important aspect of this law is it doesn't just prohibit, it prohibits people from possessing, having access, and then going out and purchase. And so I think for families where there's domestic violence and there may not be a firearm in the home, but there are threats, the fear that somebody at any moment could go out and purchase is always alive. And so this order is entered in cases where somebody may not have a firearm, but they will be prohibited from purchasing. And again, this is during the life of that order. And so I think that's another really important piece for the public to know, is this is not a protection orders, whether it's an IRPO or a domestic violence protection order, that prohibition is during the life of the order. And once it goes away, barring any other orders or any other prohibiting criminal convictions, people can possess again. And so it's a temporary, typically a temporary removal from that right.
You're all part of something kind of special here too, and that it's part of Ellie's place.
Right.
And Ellie was the courthouse dog, but also in setting up Ellie's place, it's this place, I think, of refuge in some respects. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it is being, I think, working within that context? Because there's different aspects to this too.
Right. I think, one of our colleagues has always said that, the courthouse is sort of like Harborview, right? You come here to triage, and the work is really hard, and we're going to be able to take care of it and take it on. But it's not the most welcoming of places, right? So the thought is, my supervisor would say this.
Kind of an old government building.
Right,
Yeah,
it
so
is.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
It's not the warmest, and I think we're desensitized because we're here every day. But but Ellie's place was really to give victims a sense of safety, a sense of peace, and also for all the children and families that come through. There's a lot of families that come through. That just it's a little more warm and inviting, I would say.
They're not swept up in the trauma and crisis that this building deals with on a daily basis.
Kind of like Ellie. I mean, Ellie was just a
Exactly.
sweet dog that everybody could just go and pet and just get their anxiety down.
It's also a beautiful vision of these are really important services to the public, and partnering with community-based agencies that are also have a space there, so that somebody who's being seen for a child interview also has access to someone from Harborview to connect about getting services for their children on site. So it's this, I think, remarkable vision of how when the community and systems connect, we can create things that are very meaningful to people.
And do you find an interconnection between everybody that's working there? Does sometimes some of the cases bleed over a little bit?
Yes.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
We definitely have had kids that have been investigated, or not investigated, but there's an ongoing investigation and they're perhaps a victim, and also maybe we're working with the mom on a protection order.
And then we can connect that crime victim to Project Safety, which is 5 different civil legal aid organizations who can provide pro bono assistance to people who are victims of crime for some of the legal issues that resulted from their experiences in crime. And it's a perfect partnership, and some of our cases cross lines. And we've found that to be a really important enhancement.
Well, this is hard work, but I would imagine having this opportunity to be a part of this unit is pretty fulfilling, maybe like never before.
I would definitely second that. I would say it's very purposeful, yet it's not lost on any of us the importance of what we're doing and how we have to process that and what we're doing each day. I would say it's a heavy task. I mean, you pick up the paper every day and there's a shooting somewhere in the country, right? And you're crossing your fingers that that's not one of your cases that you're working on in the team. And I think the way we get through it is that we staff with the multidisciplinary team to get different approaches. Is this the right approach to doing something, so that we're all feeling like we're part of this unit, part of this decision making?
Yeah.
And I would say, I think for anybody who's worked in King County, our work is very hard, but it's always based in a mission to serve. And with the new unit, it just feels, because of our multi-jurisdictional and multidisciplinary approach, it's just way more efficient. And we have little kind of baby steps and successes every single day that we've been in existence, things that we just didn't think we would be able to push through that we're accomplishing. So that is so reinforcing and exciting.
Well, I think the people of King County are very, very fortunate to have this unit and also Ellie's Place there, so that they can go and get the help that is needed in times of crisis. And thank you for your work. I really appreciate it very much. Sandra Shanahan and also Kimberly WYATT. Keep at it.
Thank you.
Thank you
Appreciate
so
it
much.
very much.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us for this edition of King County Connects. Please visit us online at KINGCOUNTY.GOV/KCTV. I'm ENRIQUE, and we will see you next time.